Case file number 005. Classification: Mythological and psychological phenomenon. Subject: the role of goddesses in early human civilization. For thousands of years, human civilizations have documented the existence of powerful entities believed to influence the natural world. These entities were not always associated with the sky. They were not always distant, and they were not always male. In some of the earliest recorded belief systems, power took a different form. It was associated with creation, with life, with cycles that could not be controlled, only observed, and feared. From the fertility figures of prehistoric societies, to the structured deities of Mesopotamia, to the complex systems of Egypt, and the human-like gods of Greece. These figures appear repeatedly, not as secondary beings, but as central forces, responsible not only for the creation of life, but for its continuation and its end. Unlike many early gods, these entities were not defined by a single role. They existed in duality: creation and destruction, nurture and control, order and chaos. This case file examines the origins of these figures, the civilizations that worship them, and the psychological mechanisms that may explain why they were perceived as real, not just as symbols, but as active influences, forces capable of guiding thought, shaping behavior, and altering perception. Because unlike previous cases, this phenomenon does not rely solely on external observation. It suggests something else, something internal, something that does not need to be seen, but to be experienced or believed. The objective of this case file is to determine whether these entities were created to explain the unknown, or whether they represent something more complex, a reflection of the human mind, or a response to something it does not fully understand. There is a pattern in human history, one that repeats across time, across continents, across civilizations that never spoke to each other, and yet somehow arrived at the same idea: that something is watching, something is influencing, something exists beyond what we can see, yet still shapes everything. We've talked about gods before. The sky, the storms, the forces that felt too powerful to be random. But there is another side to this story. One that is often overlooked or misunderstood entirely. Because power in the ancient world was not only associated with destruction, it was not only found in the sky, it was not only something to fear, it was something that created, something that sustained, something that existed much closer to human experience. And in many of the earliest civilizations, that power was not imagined as male. It was imagined as something else, something that could give life and take it away, something that could nurture and destroy, something that could exist as both beginning and end. Today, we examine the goddesses of the ancient world, not as background figures, not as supporting roles to gods, but as central forces in early human belief systems. We're going to look at where they came from, what they represented, how entire civilizations were shaped by them, and why, even now, these figures still feel familiar. Because this isn't just about mythology. It's about perception. It's about the human need to explain power in a way that feels understandable, controllable, personal, and maybe most importantly, what it says about us. That some of the earliest forms of power we ever created looked like this. In ancient Egypt, the world was not seen as chaotic. It was not random. It was not unpredictable in the same way early humans once feared. It was ordered, deliberate, maintained, and that order had to be protected. To the Egyptians, existence itself was fragile. Not fragile in the sense of weakness, but in the sense that it could collapse at any moment if the balance that held it together was disturbed. This balance had a name. Mayat. Mayat was not just a goddess. She was a principle, a force, a law that governed everything. Truth, justice, cosmic order, the natural balance between chaos and stability. She was not worshipped in the same way other gods were. There were no grand myths of conquest, no dramatic battles or emotional outbursts, because Mayat did not act. She existed, and because she existed, the world functioned. In Egyptian society, Mayat was not just belief. It was law. Pharaohs were expected to uphold it. Judges were expected to follow it. Citizens were expected to live by it. Because if Mayat failed, everything failed. The Nile would not flood. Crops would not grow. Society would collapse. And chaos, known as Isfet, would take its place. This is what separates Egyptian belief from many others. Their gods did not simply control the world. They maintained it. Constantly. Deliberately. And the responsibility of that maintenance was not placed on one god alone. It was shared. One of the most powerful figures within that system was Isis. Isis was one of the most widely worshipped deities in ancient Egypt. Her influence extended far beyond a single role. She was associated with motherhood, magic, healing, protection, and kingship. But what makes Isis historically significant is not just what she represented, but how she was worshipped. Temples dedicated to Isis existed across Egypt and eventually spread into the Greek and Roman worlds. Her cult grew over centuries. Her identity adapted, expanded. This is not myth as static story. This is belief as something evolving, something that moved with people, with trade, and with empires. One of the central myths involving Isis is the story of Osiris. But unlike earlier interpretations that focus on Osiris himself, the survival of that story depends entirely on her. When Osiris is killed, his body is dismembered, scattered, lost. It is Isis who searches for him, who finds every piece and reconstructs his body. And through a ritual, through magic and knowledge, she brings him back. Not permanently or completely, but enough. Enough to conceive a child. Enough to continue a lineage. Enough to ensure that death is not final. This is where Isis becomes something more than a nurturing figure. She becomes a force that challenges death itself, not through strength, but through persistence, through knowledge, through control over forces that are not fully understood. Historically, this mattered, because Egyptian belief in the afterlife was not abstract. It shaped burial practices, mummification, rituals, entire industries built around death. And at the center of that belief was the idea that death could be navigated, prepared for, and managed. Because if a goddess could move through it, so could you. But not all Egyptian goddesses were associated with preservation. Some represented something far less controlled and far less stable. Sekhmet. Sekhmet was not gentle. She was not balanced, and she was not forgiving. She was destruction. Depicted as a lioness, Sekhmet embodied a specific kind of power. Violence, plague, war. The kind of force that does not negotiate, does not hesitate, and does not stop. According to Egyptian mythology, Sekhmet was created as a weapon sent to punish humanity and to restore order through elimination. And she did, excessively, relentlessly, to the point where even the gods recognized something had gone wrong. Because destruction, once unleashed, does not always remain controlled. In order to stop her, she was deceived, given something to drink, something that resembled blood, but was not. She consumed it extensively until the violence just stopped. This is not just myth. It reflects a recognition, an understanding that destructive forces, whether natural or human, can exceed intention and can spiral, and can become something that even those who created them cannot control. And then there are goddesses like Hathor. At first glance, Hathor appears different. She is associated with love, music, joy, fertility, celebration. But like many Egyptian deities, that is only part of the story. Because Hathor and Sekhmet are sometimes understood as two sides of the same force: creation and destruction, pleasure and violence, not separate, but connected. This duality appears repeatedly in Egyptian belief, not as contradiction, but as balance. This tells us something important. Egyptian goddesses were not simplified. They were not reduced to single roles. They were complex, layered, often embodying opposing forces at the same time. And this complexity reflects something deeper, not just about their beliefs, but about their observations. Because the world itself is not singular. It creates and destroys. It sustains and takes away. And instead of separating those ideas, the Egyptians combined them, gave them form, gave them identity. But Egypt was not the only civilization to do this. As we move forward into ancient Greece, these same ideas begin to shift again. The goddesses do not disappear, but they change. They become more human, more emotional, more unpredictable, and in some cases, far more dangerous. When we move from ancient Egypt into ancient Greece, something changes. The structure remains. There are still gods, still systems, still explanations for the world. But the tone is different. Greek gods do not feel distant. They do not feel like forces maintaining balance. They feel close, uncomfortably close. They think like humans. They react like humans. They make decisions, not strictly based on order, but on emotion. And that shift changes everything. Now, power is not just something you respect. It's something you have to navigate. Among these gods, the goddesses take on a new role, not just as creators or maintainers, but rather participants, active forces within human life, and sometimes the cause of its destruction. Hera, Queen of the Gods, wife of Zeus, goddess of marriage. On the surface, that sounds stable, predictable, structured. It wasn't. Hera is one of the clearest examples of how Greek goddesses were written with complexity, but also with consequence. Because while she ruled over marriage, her own was defined by betrayal, repeated, public, unavoidable. Zeus was not loyal, and Hera could not challenge him directly. So instead, she redirected that anger toward others, women, children, anyone connected to Zeus's actions. This is not just storytelling. It reflects something deeper within Greek society. Marriage was not always about love. It was about structure, power, control. And Hera embodies that tension, the expectation of loyalty within a system that does not provide it. She is not written as purely good, nor is she written as purely evil. She is written as reactive. Athena. Athena is different. She is not driven by emotion. She is driven by strategy. The goddess of wisdom, of war, but not chaos, calculated war. She represents intelligence, planning, control over impulse. And historically, this matters. Because Athens, one of the most influential city-states in ancient Greece, was named after her. Athena's presence was political. She was not just worshipped. She was integrated into the identity of an entire civilization. Temples were built in her honor. The most famous, the Parthenon, still stands today. But even Athena is not without contradiction, because while she represents wisdom, she is also capable of punishment. Medusa. In one version of the myth, Medusa is not born a monster. She becomes one, transformed by Athena. Not for violence, not for destruction, but for something done to her within Athena's temple. The details vary depending on the source, but the outcome does not. Medusa is punished, not protected. This is where Greek mythology becomes something more than a story. It reflects power structures, responsibility, blame, and who is allowed to hold it. Aphrodite. At first, Aphrodite seems simple. The goddess of love, beauty, desire. But in Greek mythology, love is not gentle. It is disruptive. It creates conflict, obsession, war. The Trojan War, one of the most famous conflicts in Greek mythology, begins because of her, or more accurately, because of what she represents. Desire, competition, the need to possess. And historically, this reflects how the Greeks understood attraction, not as something passive, but as something powerful enough to override logic and reason and control. And then there is Persephone. Persephone exists between two worlds, the living and the dead, daughter of Demeter, goddess of agriculture, and wife of Hades, ruler of the underworld. Her story is one of transition, taken, brought below, and changed. Persephone does not return as the same person. She becomes something else, a queen, but not fully one thing. For part of the year, she exists above, and the world is alive. For the other part, she returns below, and everything begins to die. This is not just myth, it is explanation of the seasons, of change, of loss, and something else. Transformation. Across Greek mythology, goddesses are not distant. They are involved. They influence outcomes, create conflict, shift the direction of human lives. Sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, but always intentionally. And this is where something important begins to take shape. Because now, the gods are no longer just explanations for the world. They are reflections of us, of emotion, of conflict, of decision-making. And that reflection feels familiar. Which raises a different kind of question. Not about what these goddesses controlled, but about why they feel so real. And why people didn't just believe in them. They believed to have experienced them. Experiences like this don't leave behind evidence. They leave behind questions about thought, about control, and about where those thoughts actually come from. These experiences are not new. They've been described for thousands of years across cultures and civilizations. Moments where something feels intentional, guided, or just beyond explanation. And while ancient civilizations gave these experiences names, forms, and identities, modern psychology approaches them differently. Because the human brain does not experience the world passively. It interprets it constantly, automatically. And most of the time, that interpretation happens faster than we're aware of. every sound, every movement, every pattern. Your brain is asking the same question over and over again. Is this random, or is something causing it? This is known as agency detection, the brain's tendency to assume that events have intention behind them. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. If you hear something in the distance, it is safer to assume that something made it. A predator, a threat, or something watching. Even if nothing is there. Because the cost of being wrong is survival. So the brain errs on the side of caution, creates meaning before meaning is confirmed. And over time, that process becomes automatic, unquestioned. But agency detection is only part of it. Because the brain doesn't just detect intention, it creates it. Thoughts appear, decisions are made, actions are taken. And most of the time, you experience those things as yours. But not always. Sometimes, a thought feels unfamiliar, out of place, or strangely, correct, as if it arrived fully formed, without effort, without process. Psychology has explanations for this: subconscious processing, pattern recognition, the brain making connections before you're aware of them, which can create the feeling that something came from outside of you, even when it didn't, and even when it did. Here's where things become less clear. Not every experience fits neatly into explanation. Not every moment feels reducible. And even now, with everything we understand about the brain, people still report the same thing. A feeling of guidance, a sense of alignment, moments that feel intentional. Which brings us back to the ancient world. Because early humans experienced these same things, but they didn't call it subconscious processing. They gave it a name, a form, a presence, a god or a goddess. Not just as an explanation for the world, but as an explanation for themselves, for thought, for instinct, for the moments that feel just slightly beyond control, beyond understanding. And maybe that's why these figures have never fully disappeared. Because even now, we still experience things we can't fully explain. We still look for meaning. We still feel influenced. Whether that influence comes from the mind or from something else. It's a question that has never been fully answered. Because in the end, this was never just about gods or goddesses. It was about power. Not just the power to create the world, but the power to shape how we experience it. And the things we create to make sense of that feeling. Even when we're not entirely sure where it comes from. Next week, we're going deeper. Because while gods and goddesses explain the world around us, there are other things that exist much closer. And the real question isn't just whether they are real, it's why they feel real. Until next time, sleep well. I'll see you next week.